The dust cloud rose first, thick and rust-colored against the Afghan dawn, stretching 3 miles across the valley floor. Through thermal optics, the convoy commander saw what his brain refused to accept: 200 thermal signatures, maybe more, moving with tactical precision toward his position. Captain Marcus Webb keyed his radio 3 times, the emergency distress code that meant everything was already too late. His voice came out steady despite the ice flooding his veins. "Any station, this is Raven 6. Troops in contact, grid November Delta 7432, immediate air support required. We are about to be overrun." 15 vehicles trapped in a kilometer-long canyon with vertical walls on both sides, 400 meters of kill zone with nowhere to hide. The Taliban had learned patience over 2 decades of war, learned to wait and watch and choose the perfect moment when American air power was stretched thin across 3 provinces. Webb's radio man, a kid from Michigan whose hands shook as he loaded magazines, whispered that the nearest Apache was 40 minutes out. 40 minutes. They had maybe 10. The insurgents moved like water finding cracks, small teams with heavy weapons taking positions on the ridgelines, cutting off retreat, preparing the ambush that would make headlines and change rules of engagement and ruin careers in Washington. Webb thought about his daughter's birthday next month, about the video call he'd miss, about how the news would describe this. Then the radio crackled with a voice he didn't recognize, calm and almost bored. "Raven 6, Hog 11, 3 minutes out, talk to me." A single A-10 Thunderbolt, the ugliest aircraft in the inventory, built around a cannon that could shred tanks. Webb felt something unknot in his chest before logic caught up. One plane against 200 fighters spread across mountainous terrain was mathematics that didn't work. He gave coordinates, described the situation, tried to keep desperation out of his transmission. The pilot copied everything in that same unhurried tone, like she was ordering coffee instead of flying into a hellstorm alone. "Hog 11, be advised. Enemy has probable MANPADS. We've seen launcher signatures." A pause then. "Copy that. Rolling in." Webb heard it before he saw it, that distinctive sound like the sky tearing in half. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon that fired depleted uranium rounds at 65 per second. The A-10 came over the ridgeline inverted gray-green camouflage against pale sky, so low its shadow touched the rocks. The aircraft rolled upright at the last possible second, the pilot pulling maneuvers that turned physics into suggestion. Lieutenant Commander Kestrel Kess Thorne had 3,000 hours in the A-10, more combat time than most pilots twice her age, and a reputation that preceded her like a warning. At 28, she'd already survived 2 shoot-downs, 1 engine failure, and the kind of bureaucratic hostility that made enemy fire feel straightforward by comparison. The boys back at Bagram called her last call because she always showed up when everything else had failed, though never to her face, never with the respect that title deserved. Through her heads-up display, she mapped the enemy positions in seconds, identifying the mortar teams first, then the machine gun nests, then the RPG crews waiting to target the convoy's lead vehicles. Her weapons systems officer, a captain named DeMarco who'd requested transfer after 1 mission with her, wasn't on this flight. She'd launched alone when the distress call came through, against protocol, against orders, because someone had to and everyone else was calculating risk versus reward while Americans died. She pickled off 2 Maverick missiles at the mortar positions, watched the infrared blooms through her targeting pod, then dove toward the western ridgeline where the heaviest concentration of fighters had established overlapping fields of fire. The ground rushed up in her canopy, brown and pitiless. Her training instructor's voice echoed in memory. "The A-10 doesn't dogfight, it doesn't look pretty, it just refuses to die." She understood that airplane on a molecular level, understood that survival wasn't about elegance but about stubborn, grinding persistence. The cannon sang its terrible song, each burst lasting 2 seconds, long enough to draw a line of destruction across the mountainside. Brass casings rained down, glittering in the sun. Below, Taliban fighters scattered from positions they'd held for hours, tactical discipline dissolving into basic survival instinct. Kess banked hard left, pulled 6GS that grayed her vision at the edges, came around for another pass. The radio chatter told its own story. Webb's voice gaining confidence, his sergeants calling out targets, the convoy starting to believe they might actually live. She checked her fuel state, did the math, knew she had maybe 15 minutes before she'd have to break off. 15 minutes to convince 200 hostiles that staying meant death. The sky belonged to her in those moments, belonged to the strange poetry of controlled violence that separated professional warriors from everyone else. Kes had grown up in Montana, daughter of a crop duster and a high school physics teacher, spent her childhood watching her father dance ancient biplanes through mountain valleys with the kind of casual precision that made impossible look routine. She'd soloed at 16, joined the Air Force at 18, and spent the next decade proving herself in a culture that smiled while it doubted. Every evaluation praised her skills while questioning her judgment. Every promotion board noted her aggressive tendencies. Every male pilot she outflew found reasons to explain why it didn't count. The resentment had calcified into something harder than anger, into a cold determination to be so undeniably excellent that excuses withered in the light. She walked runway patterns in her sleep, could calculate weapons release points in her head faster than the computer, and flew with the kind of situational awareness that looked like precognition. Now she dove again, targeting a cluster of fighters trying to regroup near a dried riverbed. The A-10 shuddered as she fired, the recoil so powerful it actually slowed the aircraft, 30mm rounds the size of milk bottles turning rocks and earth into chaos. Someone on the ground fired a shoulder-launched missile, the smoke trail arcing up like a question mark. Kes dropped flares, chaff, jinked hard right, felt the proximity sensor scream as the missile passed within 50 meters of her tail. Her heart rate never changed, still that steady 65 beats per minute that had made flight surgeons recheck their instruments. She keyed her radio. Raven 6, Hog 11, need damage assessment on that mortar position, grid ND 7451. Webb's response came fast, almost grateful. Good hits, Hog 11, that position is destroyed. Kes allowed herself the smallest smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes but acknowledged the scoreboard. Below, the ambush was collapsing, the careful Taliban planning unraveling as their casualties mounted and the promised easy victory turned into nightmare. The fuel gauge demanded attention, its amber warning light a countdown she couldn't ignore. Kes calculated vectors, alternates, the distance to Bagram versus the smaller forward operating base at Shank. She could make it back, probably, if she left now and climbed to optimal altitude and didn't divert for anything. But the Taliban weren't finished, just disorganized, and the moment she left they'd remember their numbers and their training. She thought about Webb down there, about his soldiers who'd woken up this morning expecting another routine patrol, about the mathematics of survival and the weight of decisions that looked simple from behind a desk in Virginia. Her father had once told her that flying was just applied philosophy, that every flight was a negotiation between what you wanted and what physics allowed. She thumbed her radio again. Raven 6, Hog 11, I'm Winchester on Mavericks, but I've got plenty of 30 Mike, what do you need? The pause before Webb answered told her everything. He understood what she was offering, understood the fuel calculation she'd just rejected. Hog 11, we've got dismounts moving to flanking positions, Eastern Ridge, approximately 40 personnel. Kes rolled inverted to spot them, saw the thermal signatures strung out along a goat path, moving with purpose toward a position that would enfilade the convoy's defensive line. She rolled back, nose down, felt the A-10 accelerate into the attack. The aircraft felt like an extension of her intention, responding before she fully formed the thought. This was the marriage between pilot and machine that transcended technical competence, that entered the territory of art. She fired, adjusted, fired again, walked the cannon's destruction across the ridge with surgical precision. Spent casings tumbled earthward in a bronze rain. The 30mm rounds didn't just hit targets, they deleted them, left nothing but memory and blood mist. The survivors broke and ran, abandoning weapons, abandoning the mission, choosing life over martyrdom. The radio came alive with multiple voices. Webb's platoon leaders reporting enemy withdrawal, spotters confirming the Taliban retreat, someone saying what everyone was thinking. That warthog just saved our asses. Kess climbed to 3,000 feet, scanning for threats, watching her fuel totalizer count down toward minimum recovery quantity. She had maybe 5 minutes left on station, 5 minutes before she'd have to trust that she'd done enough. Below, the convoy was moving again, pushing through the kill zone while they had the chance, leaving the ambush site with its scattered dead and abandoned equipment. She'd changed the mathematics, turned a massacre into a story soldiers would tell later over beers, embellishing her approach, making the victory sound inevitable. Her hands moved across the cockpit controls with practiced efficiency, documenting weapons expenditure, logging coordinates, doing the administrative dance that followed violence. The adrenaline would come later in the ready room when her body finally processed what her mind had simply filed under Thursday. She keyed the radio one last time. Raven 6, Hog 11 is bingo fuel, returning to base. You're clear to continue movement. Good luck down there. Webb's response carried weight beyond words. Hog 11, Raven 6, I don't know who you are, but I owe you about 400 beers. Thank you isn't enough. Kess felt something shift in her chest, that recognition landing differently than medals or performance reviews. Just doing the job, Raven 6. Stay safe. She turned northeast toward Bagram, leaving the valley and its ghosts behind, climbing into clean sky where the only thing chasing her was reputation. The A-10 climbed steady and slow, built for endurance rather than elegance, scarred and patched and absolutely reliable. She understood that airplane better than she understood most people, recognized their shared quality of being underestimated until the moment mattered. The cockpit smelled like burnt metal and hydraulic fluid and cordite, the particular perfume of combat operations. The landing at Bagram came with an audience she hadn't expected. Word had spread through channels faster than she'd flown, radio chatter between units turning her call sign into legend before she'd even touched concrete. The maintenance crew that met her aircraft wore expressions caught between respect and curiosity, looking at her like she'd done something impossible instead of just necessary. She climbed down from the cockpit feeling the weight of those 3,000 hours, feeling older than 28, feeling the disconnect between the person who'd launched solo into chaos and the lieutenant commander who now had to write the after-action report. Her flight suit was dark with sweat despite the cooling vest, her legs unsteady from sustained G-forces, her hands finally starting to shake with the delayed adrenaline dump. A major she didn't recognize approached, smart enough to read her body language, smart enough to give her space. Hell of a job up there, Lieutenant Commander. Wing Commander wants to see you. Kess nodded, didn't trust her voice yet, walked toward the operations building on legs that remembered how to move out of habit rather than conscious thought. The story would spread now, would get told and retold until the truth underneath became obscured by mythology. She'd be praised in official channels while being quietly criticized for violating procedures, for taking unnecessary risks, for being everything they trained her to be while simultaneously holding her to different standards than the men who did the same. The politics exhausted her more than the flying ever could, the constant navigation of being exceptional enough to be undeniable, but not so different that she threatened comfortable hierarchies. Inside the operations center, the wing commander was already watching the gun camera footage, the black and white thermal imagery showing her attack runs from the A-10's perspective. He looked up as she entered, gestured to a chair she didn't want to sit in because sitting meant staying meant talking. Lieutenant Commander Thorne. Colonel Mitchell was career Air Force, 25 years in, with enough combat decorations that he understood the difference between tactics and survival. He'd been the one to approve her transfer to Bagram despite the reservations of every officer who'd written evaluations calling her difficult and unorthodox. His expression gave away nothing as he replayed the footage. Walk me through your decision tree when you received the distress call. Kess stood at parade rest, her voice finding its professional register. Sir, The convoy's coordinates put them outside our standard area of responsibility, but within fuel range. I assessed that response time was critical and that waiting for flight authorization would result in friendly casualties. I launched immediately and proceeded direct to the target area. Mitchell nodded slowly. Let silence do its work. You launched without a wingman, without clearance from TOC, and engaged a force that outnumbered you 200 to 1. She met his eyes, refusing to flinch. Yes, sir. The tactical situation required immediate response. Any delay would have cost American lives. Another nod, longer this time. Captain Webb's report is going up the chain. He's crediting you with saving 15 vehicles and 400 personnel. Initial casualty count from the Taliban side is 67 confirmed KIA, dozens more wounded. You turned what should have been our worst day this month into their worst day this year. The pause stretched. That being said, you violated about 8 different protocols, risked a multi-million-dollar aircraft, and put yourself in a situation where recovery would have been impossible if you'd been hit. Kes felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the sense of accomplishment curdling into bureaucratic censure. Understood, sir. I made the tactical assessment that. Mitchell held up a hand. I'm not finished. You did exactly what I would have done, what any pilot worth the wings on their chest should have done. But there are people above me who care more about policy than results, who will want to make an example. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with the kind of attention that made her skin prickle. Your call sign, Mitchell said, his tone shifting into something almost curious. Kes, short for Kestrel, I assume. Do you know why they gave you that? She did know, but she let him tell it anyway, understanding this was some kind of test. A kestrel is a small falcon that hovers in place, almost motionless, scanning the ground for prey. When it spots something, it drops like a stone, fast and precise. The boys gave you that call sign 2 years ago after that mission near Kandahar, where you held station for 90 minutes, well past bingo fuel, because you knew the ground team wasn't out of danger yet. Mitchell pulled up another file on his screen. Your instructor pilots at Moody wrote that you had exceptional aircraft handling skills but questionable judgment regarding risk tolerance. Your squadron commander at Davis-Monthan noted superior tactical awareness undermined by tendency toward lone wolf operations. You see the pattern. Kes felt heat rising in her face, the familiar anger that came with being praised and criticized in the same breath. Sir, with respect, I've never lost a soldier I was supporting, never failed to complete a mission, and my safety record is impeccable, Mitchell finished. You've been shot at more than most pilots with twice your hours, and you always bring the airplane home. That's not judgment I'm questioning, Lieutenant Commander. That's culture. He stood, walked to the window overlooking the flight line where her A-10 sat surrounded by maintenance crews documenting battle damage. You're better than most of the pilots in this wing, male or female, and that makes people uncomfortable. They want to believe success comes from following procedure, from checking boxes, from being part of the team. Then someone like you shows up and succeeds by being individually excellent, by trusting instinct over process, and it threatens the narrative. He turned back to face her. Captain Webb isn't the first soldier you've saved, won't be the last, but this one's going viral. By evening, the story had reached the secure internet terminals where soldiers from other units logged in to check emails and watch morale-destroying news from home. Someone had leaked audio from the engagement, Webb's voice calling for help, then Kes responding with that preternatural calm, then the sound of the GAU-8 turning mountains into moonscape. The combat footage spread through encrypted channels, jumped to unsecured forums, got picked up by military blogs, and then mainstream media. By midnight, Hog 11 was trending on platforms Kes didn't use, her call sign becoming shorthand for something larger than the mission itself. She tried to sleep in her quarters, a converted shipping container with air conditioning that worked intermittently and walls thin enough to hear everything. Her roommate, a Marine helicopter pilot named Rodriguez, had texted, "You're famous, prepare for weirdness." Famous wasn't what she wanted, had never been the goal. She joined to fly, stayed for the mission, endured the politics because the alternative was walking away from the only thing she'd ever been truly exceptional at. The attention felt like exposure, like being visible in ways that invited scrutiny she couldn't control. Someone knocked on her door at 0130, tentative and apologetic. A captain from public affairs, looking exhausted and slightly terrified, carrying a tablet with media requests. "Ma'am, I know this is irregular, but you're all over the news stateside. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, they all want interviews. The Pentagon is getting calls." Kess sat up on her cot, scrubbed her face with both hands. "Tell them no. Standard policy, no active duty interviews from combat zones." The captain shifted his weight, clearly delivering someone else's message. "Ma'am, Colonel Mitchell's guidance was to give you the choice. He thinks this could be important visibility-wise. For women in combat roles, for the Air Force, for recruitment," Kess finished, understanding the machinery now. "I'm not a poster captain. I'm a pilot. Tell whoever needs to know that I appreciate the interest, but my job is flying, not talking about flying." She lay back down, dismissed him with body language. The attention didn't fade the way she'd hoped. By the third day after the Valley engagement, Hog 11 had been interviewed by every major network despite her refusal to participate. They found Webb, who spoke with the fervor of a convert, describing her precision and timing in language that elevated tactics into theology. They found soldiers from previous missions, men who'd been in similar situations, pulled back from the edge by that same calm voice and that ugly, beautiful airplane. They interviewed pilots she'd served with, most of them trying to be supportive while subtly distancing themselves from her methods. The narrative built itself without her input, taking on weight and momentum that felt inevitable, dangerous. Kess kept flying, took every mission offered, volunteered for the worst weather and the most complex tactical situations. Her logbook filled with coordinates and altitudes and fuel calculations, the mathematical poetry of survival. She flew cover for resupply convoys, provided overwatch for special operations insertions, destroyed Taliban fighting positions with the methodical precision of someone solving equations. Each mission added hours to her total, added stories to the growing mythology, added weight to the question she'd been avoiding. What came after? Lieutenant colonels didn't fly combat missions forever, and she was already 3 years ahead of the promotion timeline. Staff positions waited in her future, jobs that involved PowerPoint more than throttle controls, career progression that looked like slow death from her current perspective. She tried not to think about it, tried to stay present in the cockpit where problems had solutions and excellence was measurable. But the future crept in around the edges, unavoidable as weather. One evening, she found herself in the ready room with half a dozen other pilots, a rare moment of downtime between missions. They were watching replays of airshow footage, the Thunderbirds pulling formation maneuvers that looked impossible, when someone mentioned her name. "Kess, you ever think about applying?" She looked up from the maintenance report she'd been reviewing, not following. Applying to what? A major named Patterson, solid pilot with a dry sense of humor, gestured at the screen. "Demo teams. With your hours and the publicity, you'd be a shoo-in. First female A-10 demo pilot would be huge." The suggestion landed wrong, felt like relegation. "I'm not interested in being a symbol," she said, sharper than intended. "I'm interested in the mission." Patterson held up his hands, backing off. "Just saying you've got options. Not everyone wants to fly combat forever." But that was exactly it. She did want to fly combat forever, wanted the clarity of objective and execution, wanted the purity of skill meeting necessity without the contamination of politics or optics. Airshows were performance, choreographed routines for civilian crowds who couldn't understand what they were watching. Real flying happened at low altitude over hostile terrain with people shooting at you and fuel running low and decisions measured in heartbeats. Everything else felt like compromise. She went back to her maintenance report, the conversation dying awkwardly around her. Later, walking back to her quarters under a sky so full of stars it hurt to look at, she wondered if that stubbornness was wisdom or limitation. The younger version of herself had been certain there was a right way to live, a path that meant never settling, never accepting less than total commitment. But she was starting to understand that time enforced compromises that principle couldn't prevent. Bodies aged, eyes deteriorated, reaction times slowed by milliseconds that mattered at the margins. She had maybe 10 more years of frontline flying before the calculus shifted, before she became the experienced hand training younger pilots instead of the tip of the spear. The thought felt like failure even though she knew it was just reality. The mathematics of combat aviation were brutal and simple. You flew until you couldn't, then you did something else or you got out. 2 weeks after the Valley, Colonel Mitchell summoned her again. This time his office held visitors, a two-star general from Air Combat Command, and a civilian in an expensive suit who introduced himself as being from the Pentagon's Public Affairs Directorate. Kess felt her defenses rising before anyone spoke. The general stood to shake her hand, his grip professional and brief. Lieutenant Commander Thorne, General Reeves. That was exceptional work in the Valley. I've reviewed the footage and the after-action reports. Textbook close air support under extreme conditions. She waited for the other shoe, the qualification that always followed praise. The civilian stepped forward, his smile practiced and empty. The Air Force is at a critical juncture regarding public perception. The success of our mission depends on sustained support from Congress and the American people. Your actions demonstrate exactly the kind of capability and professionalism we want to highlight. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in. Sir, with respect, I'm not comfortable being used for publicity. My job is flying missions, not making appearances. General Reeves exchanged a look with Mitchell, some silent communication that excluded her. Lieutenant Commander, this isn't a request for you to become a spokesperson. What we're proposing is a short tour stateside, maybe 30 days, doing a limited number of appearances at recruiting events, maybe testifying before a congressional subcommittee about close air support capabilities. Your presence would communicate more than any briefing deck. Kess felt the trap closing, felt the machinery of military politics grinding into motion. She'd flown 63 combat missions in the last 6 months, logged more hours providing direct support to ground forces than anyone in her squadron. Now they wanted to pull her from the rotation, turn her into an exhibit at the kind of events where generals gave speeches and everyone pretended the war was going exactly as planned. How long would I be grounded? She asked, her voice flat. The question hung there while the civilian checked his tablet and the general maintained his expression of benevolent authority. 30 days, the civilian repeated. Maximum 45 if the schedule expands. You'd be back in rotation by early December. 3 months minimum in reality, Kess knew, because military schedules had the integrity of cotton candy. 3 months of smiling for cameras while her skills atrophied, while other pilots logged the hours that led to command positions, while the war continued without her contribution. And if I decline, Mitchell spoke before anyone else could answer, then you keep flying your missions here and we find someone else for the publicity tour. But Lieutenant Commander, I'll be direct with you, this is career capital. The Air Force needs heroes, especially heroes who don't look like the stereotype. You can resent that reality, or you can use it to advance to positions where you have real influence over policy and training. The calculation was obvious and insulting in its transparency. Play the game now, gain currency for later. Except Kess had watched enough careers to know how this worked. Officers who left the cockpit for staff jobs rarely made it back, got pulled into the gravity well of Pentagon assignments and PowerPoint presentations, until flying became something they used to do rather than something they were. She looked at General Reeves, at his chest full of ribbons from a career spent climbing the hierarchy, and wondered if he missed it, the stick in his hands and the earth falling away. I need time to think about it, she said, which was politician speak for no, but with enough ambiguity to avoid immediate confrontation. The general nodded like he'd expected exactly this response. You have 48 hours, Lieutenant Commander. After that, we need to start coordinating schedules. He stood, ending the meeting with the abrupt efficiency of someone with 17 other obligations. For what it's worth, what you did out there matters. Make sure your decision reflects that. Kess spent the next day flying, taking a routine patrol mission that required nothing from her except presence and vigilance. The sky over Afghanistan was postcard perfect, hard blue with clouds like torn cotton clinging to the Hindu Kush. Below, the country sprawled in shades of brown and gray, beautiful and hostile in equal measure, home to people who'd been fighting someone for 3 decades. She thought about Webb and his convoy, about the mathematics she'd changed by being willing to launch alone. How many times could one person change those calculations before the universe demanded balance? The Buddhist monks she'd met once in Thailand would probably have an answer, something about detachment and the illusion of individual action. But she was a pilot, not a philosopher, and her brain worked in vectors and fuel loads rather than koans. The radio crackled with routine traffic, other aircraft checking in, controllers managing the aerial dance that kept everyone separated and alive. She listened with half her attention, the other half running calculations about decisions and consequences. If she took the tour, she'd lose momentum, become known for publicity rather than proficiency. If she declined, she'd be marked as difficult, as someone who didn't understand how institutional advancement worked. The pure tactical choice had no right answer, just different flavors of compromise. She banked toward the sunset, watching the light turn the mountains into layers of purple and gold shadow. Her father had taught her that the best decisions came from the gut, from the instinct that lived below conscious thought. Her instructor pilots had taught her to trust the instruments even when instinct screamed otherwise. The contradiction sat in her chest like a stone. Hog 1-1, Bagram Control, you're cleared for return to base. Report initial. Kess rogered up, turned northeast toward home, the decision still unmade but the deadline ticking closer. The A-10 flew steady through the dimming sky, reliable as gravity, asking nothing except her attention and skill. That night she found Rodriguez in the makeshift gym, pounding out frustration on a speed bag with the kind of intensity that suggested her day hadn't gone better. They nodded at each other, the communication of people who understood that sometimes talking made things worse. Kess worked through her routine, the physical maintenance that kept her body functional in an environment that wanted to break it down. 45 minutes later, drenched in sweat and marginally calmer, she sat on the bench and finally asked what she'd been avoiding. Did they ever try to pull you for publicity stuff? Rodriguez paused mid-rep, set down the barbell with a clang that echoed in the empty space. Twice. After I flew that extraction near Fallujah, they wanted me to do recruitment videos. Said no both times. She stripped off her lifting gloves, sat down next to Kess. Cost me a promotion, or at least that's what my mentor implied. But I'm still flying, still doing the job, so maybe it was worth it. You ever regret it? Rodriguez considered this with the same care she brought to approach calculations. Some days, when I see people I came up with getting bird colonel while I'm still a major, yeah, I wonder if I played the game wrong. But then I wake up and fly and remember why I'm here. It's not for career progression or pension points. It's because I'm good at this and it matters and I'm not ready to stop. The simple clarity of that statement landed like a benchmark, like something solid in a world of shifting expectations. Kess felt something unknot in her chest, not certainty but permission to trust the instinct she'd been second-guessing. Thanks, she said, meaning it. For what? Rodriguez asked, genuinely puzzled. For reminding me why I'm here. Kess stood, headed for the showers, the decision finally crystallizing into something she could articulate. She'd tell General Reeves no, politely and professionally, and accept whatever consequences followed. Her career might stall, might plateau at ranks that looked disappointing in official biographies. But she'd keep flying, keep being the voice on the radio that meant someone was coming, keep changing the mathematics of survival. The conversation with General Reeves the next day went exactly as expected, disappointment wrapped in professional courtesy, subtle implications about career limitations, suggestions that she was missing the bigger picture. Kess sat at attention, let him finish his prepared remarks, then declined with the same calm she brought to combat operations. Mitchell walked her out afterward, his expression unreadable. You know what you just did, he said, not quite a question. Yes, sir. I chose the cockpit over the Pentagon. He stopped at the door to the operations building, looked out at the flight line where maintenance crews swarmed over aircraft in the perpetual dance of keeping machinery functional. I did the same thing about 15 years ago. Different circumstances, same choice. Made colonel, probably won't make general, and I sleep fine. But I want you to understand, the Air Force will remember this as you being difficult rather than you being principled. Kess nodded, accepting the weight of that reality. Understood, sir. I can live with difficult. Mitchell almost smiled. Good, because you're back on the flight schedule tomorrow and we've got a convoy heading into Lager province that's going to need close air support. Hostile area, high probability of contact. I want someone I trust running overhead. The mission brief came at 0530, too early and too comprehensive. Maps and intelligence reports and rules of engagement that tried to codify chaos into PowerPoint slides. 20 vehicles pushing through terrain that belonged to the Taliban at night and only nominally to anyone during the day. Kess listened to the ground commander's brief, memorized faces and call signs, studied terrain features that would become reference points when everything went wrong. The other pilot assigned, a captain named Wu with 500 hours in theater, looked at her with the kind of respect that came from reputation rather than acquaintance. Heard you like to get close, he said. She shrugged. Close is where accurate happens. They launched at dawn, 2 A-10s running 30 seconds in trail, climbing into sky that promised perfect visibility and no mercy. The convoy rolled out of forward operating base Chapman right on schedule, their tire tracks cutting fresh lines in dust that recorded every movement. Kess established orbit at 8,000 feet, high enough to see the tactical picture, low enough to respond immediately when physics demanded attention. The landscape below looked peaceful from altitude, just earth and erosion and the patient geometry of time. Humans were the anomaly, the moving pieces that didn't belong in the geological stillness. Wu flew high cover while she descended to 4,000 feet, running along the convoy's route about 2 clicks ahead, scanning for the signs that separated normal from threat. An hour into the movement, nothing but routine traffic on the radio. 2 hours, one vehicle with mechanical issues that got swapped out, the convoy slowing but maintaining progress. 3 hours, approaching the zone where intelligence had flagged, high probability of insurgent activity, which was military bureaucracy for people definitely want to kill you here. Kess tightened her scan pattern, looking for vehicles that didn't belong, for the absence of civilians that meant locals knew something was coming. Then she saw it, not a threat but the negative space around a threat, a compound with fresh tire tracks but no people visible, curtains drawn on windows despite the morning heat. She keyed her radio. Guardian 6, Hog 11, recommend you hold position. I've got something that doesn't feel right, grid Papa Tango 8843. The ground commander, a major named Parrish with 3 deployments and the judgment that came from surviving them, didn't hesitate. Hog 11, Guardian 6 is holding. What are you seeing? Kess described the compound. The anomalies that individually meant nothing but together spelled ambush. Parrish conferred with his team then. Hog 11, we're going to investigate. Can you provide overwatch? She dropped lower, circling the compound in a left-hand bank that kept her targeting pod focused on the structure. Wu moved to cover her, the partnership working without excess communication. The compound erupted before Guardian 6 even approached, RPGs launching from concealed positions, machine gun fire stitching patterns in the dirt. The ambush had been waiting for the convoy to enter the kill zone, but Kess's early warning had disrupted their timing. Now they were committed, forced to engage before optimal positioning, and that hesitation cost them surprise. She rolled in immediately, pickled a Maverick into the main building, watched it disintegrate in a pressure wave that shook the ground. Wu followed with his own missile, destroying a secondary structure that had been camouflaging a mortar position. The Taliban fighters broke cover, some trying to flee, others maintaining fire discipline and engaging the convoy from new positions. Kess switched to guns, the GAU-8 doing its brutal work with precision that looked like mercy from altitude but was just physics and depleted uranium. Each burst lasted exactly the time needed to destroy the target, no more, no less. She'd learned early in her career that ammo conservation wasn't just tactical necessity, but ethical requirement. Every round had to matter, had to serve the mission rather than her anger or fear. The engagement lasted 11 minutes from first shot to final target destroyed. When it ended, Guardian 6 reported 2 wounded, no dead, and expressed gratitude that carried the weight of near misses and alternate timelines. Kess acknowledged, refocused on the mission, stayed on station until the convoy cleared the danger area, and continued their movement. The rest of the day passed without incident, the Taliban knowing better than to try again after losing 20 fighters and multiple weapon positions. She landed at Bagram 7 hours after launching, exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Wu caught her on the flight line, his face showing the peculiar expression of someone processing violence from altitude. "You saw that compound before anything happened." "How?" Kess shrugged. "Pattern recognition. Something felt wrong, so I looked closer." The story from Lagar province spread slower than the Valley incident, but it spread. Guardian 6's report emphasized that Kess's early warning had prevented what would have been significant casualties, possibly vehicles destroyed, definitely a tactical defeat. Combined with the Valley engagement, she was building a track record that transcended the normal metrics of pilot proficiency. The Air Force started treating her differently, subtly, the way institutions handle people who have become inconveniently exceptional. She noticed it in small ways, mission planners specifically requesting her for high-risk support, ground commanders asking if Hog 11 was available, other pilots studying her gun camera footage like religious text. The attention brought scrutiny too, questions about her fuel management on extended missions, reviews of her approach patterns, administrative audits of her maintenance logs searching for something, anything, that would validate the discomfort her competence generated. She understood the psychology, had studied enough history to recognize the pattern. Every barrier that fell created resentment in people invested in its permanence. Women pilots had been flying combat for 20 years, but cultural inertia moved slower than policy changes, and excellence from unexpected sources always demanded explanation. She was too good to dismiss, but too different to celebrate without reservation. The contradiction created institutional stress that expressed itself in passive-aggressive administrative burdens and subtle career obstacles. Colonel Mitchell ran interference where he could, but he was swimming against current too, fighting battles in meeting rooms where she couldn't help. Kess focused on flying, logged missions with the same steady accumulation that had defined her career, trusted that competence would eventually overcome bias through sheer accumulated weight. It was a long game, exhausting in its persistence, but she'd never expected otherwise. 3 months after the Valley, a package arrived at her quarters, forwarded through military mail with enough stamps to suggest it had traveled the world twice. The package contained a combat patch from Raven 6's unit, signed by every soldier in the convoy Webb had commanded. The note was handwritten, Webb's script cramped but legible. "You gave us a future. We're naming our daughters after you." Kess sat on her cot holding the patch, feeling something break open in her chest that she'd been keeping locked. The cynicism that had armored her against disappointment cracked, not shattering but developing fissures that let light through. Maybe the politics and the career games and the institutional resistance mattered less than this, than soldiers going home to their families, because she'd been willing to launch alone into chaos. Maybe the scoreboard wasn't promotions and medals, but moments like these, tangible proof that skill and courage combined to change outcomes. She pinned the patch to the board above her bunk, next to her father's crop dusting license and her mother's equation for calculating orbital mechanics. Her personal history and talismans, each object representing a moment when someone believed she could do something that looked impossible. The weight of expectation had always felt like burden, but maybe it was also gift, the privilege of being trusted when everything mattered. That night she dreamed of Montana, of her father's biplane dancing through mountain valleys, the aircraft responding to his touch like thought made physical. In the dream she was flying too, but her airplane was the A-10, ugly and scarred and absolutely reliable, and the mountains below were Afghanistan's Hindu Kush instead of the Rockies. Her father flew alongside her, the two aircraft in loose formation, and he was saying something she couldn't quite hear over the engine noise. She banked closer, trying to catch his words, and he was smiling that same smile he'd worn when she soloed, pride and sadness mixing into something bittersweet. Then she was alone again, her father's plane gone, just her and the sky and the mission. She woke before dawn, the dream fading but its emotional residue lingering. 4 months into her deployment, Colonel Mitchell called her into his office with news that felt inevitable. "You're being put up for the Distinguished Flying Cross," he said without preamble. "The Valley engagement and 3 subsequent missions where you provided critical support under fire. General Reeves is pushing it through despite your decision to decline the publicity tour." Kess felt the weight of recognition settling onto her shoulders, heavier than she'd expected. The DFC was serious hardware, given for heroism in aerial combat and historically rare for women pilots. Getting it meant official acknowledgement that her actions had risen above normal excellence into the territory of courage under fire. It also meant more visibility, more expectations, more pressure to be representative rather than individual. "When's the ceremony?" she asked, already calculating how to minimize the spectacle. Mitchell's expression suggested he'd anticipated this response. "They want to do it stateside, make it a big event. I told them you wouldn't go for that. Compromise is a ceremony here at Bagram, limited attendance. You get back to flying the next day." She felt gratitude for Mitchell's understanding, for his willingness to run interference against the machinery that wanted to turn her into symbol. "Thank you, sir. That works." The ceremony happened on a Tuesday morning in the base theater, attended by her squadron, some ground commanders she'd supported, and a 2-star general who'd flown in specifically for the presentation. The citation was read aloud, describing her actions in language that made them sound cleaner than they'd felt, turning chaos into narrative with clear beginning and resolution. When the general pinned the medal to her uniform, she thought about Webb's soldiers, about the 37 other missions she'd flown where the outcome wasn't newsworthy but mattered just as much. Recognition felt arbitrary, luck about which moments got witnessed and documented, but she accepted it with the grace her mother had taught her, acknowledged the honor without claiming exceptionalism. The attention that followed the DFC came in waves, each one demanding different responses. Media requests continued despite her refusals, journalists finding creative ways to request interviews through official channels. Think pieces appeared analyzing what her success meant for women in combat, for military culture, for American foreign policy. She was simultaneously celebrated as a trailblazer and criticized for being too aggressive, too individualistic, too unwilling to play the political games that supposedly mattered. The contradictions were exhausting, the constant requirement to be both exceptional and humble, confident but not threatening, competent but not intimidating. She withdrew into flying, took every mission she could, stayed in the cockpit where performance was measurable and politics couldn't reach. Her logbook grew dense with entries, coordinates and altitudes and outcomes that told their own story. By month 6 of her deployment, she'd flown more combat hours than any other pilot in her squadron, logged more time supporting ground forces, destroyed more enemy positions. The numbers were objective, undeniable, and yet still subject to qualifications about her unorthodox approach and tendency to exceed mission parameters. The institutional discomfort with her success became background noise, like tinnitus she'd learned to ignore. Rodriguez noticed the toll it was taking, cornered her one evening after a particularly long mission. "You're running on empty," she said, not quite accusation. "When's the last time you took a day off?" Kess had to think about it, couldn't actually remember. "I'm fine. Just want to maximize my time here before the deployment ends." Rodriguez gave her a look that suggested she wasn't buying it. "You're trying to prove something that's already proven. Everybody knows you're exceptional. Grinding yourself down doesn't change the minds that are already made up." The words landed with uncomfortable accuracy. "So what do you suggest?" Kess asked, genuine curiosity mixing with defensive irritation. "I suggest you remember you're human." The suggestion proved harder to implement than articulate. Kess tried taking a day off, found herself in the gym at 0530 because her body didn't know how to sleep past dawn. She attended a morale event, the kind of mandatory fun that made deployment bearable for normal people, and left after 20 minutes because the small talk felt like sand in her teeth. She started a letter to her parents, got 3 paragraphs in, deleted it all because she didn't know how to explain what she was feeling. The gap between who she was at altitude and who she was on the ground had widened into a canyon she couldn't bridge. In the cockpit, everything made sense. Every decision had measurable consequences. Every skill had specific application. On the ground, she was navigating social dynamics that felt deliberately opaque, reading subtext in conversations where people said one thing and meant another, managing perceptions that mattered more than performance. The dissonance was maddening. She found herself volunteering for missions other pilots avoided, the night operations and complex tactical situations that required total concentration. That focus was relief, was meditation, was the only space where her brain stopped cataloging political calculations and simply solved problems. She knew this pattern was unsustainable, knew burnout was cumulative and patient, but the alternative felt like surrender. 8 months into deployment, Colonel Mitchell grounded her, not as punishment but as requirement, the mandatory rest period that regulations enforced when commanders noticed pilots pushing past safe limits. "You've logged more hours than anyone should in this time frame," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. 2 weeks, no flying, no mission planning, no volunteering to fill gaps in the schedule. Go to Kabul, take actual leave, remember there's a world outside the cockpit. Kess wanted to argue, felt the objection forming, then recognized the futility. Mitchell was right. She was running past redline, and continuation meant degraded performance that put others at risk. She accepted the grounding with grace she didn't feel. Kabul felt surreal after months at Bagram. Urban chaos replacing military order. Civilians everywhere creating traffic patterns that defied logic. Kess checked into a hotel that catered to contractors and off-duty military, a strange liminal space between war and normal that satisfied neither category. She slept for 16 hours straight, woke disoriented and vaguely guilty, spent the day walking streets where nobody knew her call sign or cared about her combat hours. The anonymity was disorienting and liberating in equal measure. She found herself in a bazaar, surrounded by carpets and spices and merchants who saw her as customer rather than symbol. An old man selling tea invited her to sit, his English accented but clear, and they talked about nothing important, weather and food and the mountains that ringed the city. He didn't ask about the war, didn't care what she did for living, treated her like human rather than service member. The conversation felt like water on parched earth, normalcy that reminded her there was world beyond tactics and targeting. On day 4, she met another pilot in the hotel restaurant, an Air Force major named Holloway who flew transports and had the exhausted contentment of someone who'd made peace with limitations. They shared a table because the place was crowded, started talking because silence felt awkward. "Your hog, 1-1, he said, recognition dawning. Kess Thorne. She felt the familiar tightness, the sense of being known for actions rather than person. "Just Kess right now. I'm on leave." He raised his coffee in acknowledgement. "Fair enough. Just Holloway also on leave, also trying to remember what normal feels like." They talked for 3 hours about everything except flying, finding common ground in the absurdity of military bureaucracy and the challenge of explaining deployments to family who hadn't served. Holloway had wife and 2 kids, showed photos with the casual pride of someone whose identity extended beyond uniform. Kess felt envy sharp enough to examine, recognizing she'd built her life around singular focus. The realization that she'd sacrificed breadth for depth hit harder than expected. Back in her hotel room, Kess inventoried her life with the same analytical attention she brought to mission planning. At 28, she had no significant relationships, few friendships that extended beyond professional respect, hobbies that had atrophied into nothing, interests that had narrowed to single point. Flying had consumed everything, become both identity and escape, leaving no room for the messy complications of actual living. Her parents called every week, conversations that felt like status reports rather than connection. Her college friends had stopped inviting her to reunions after the third year she declined. The flight suit had become armor that protected her from vulnerability by eliminating opportunities to be vulnerable. The pattern was clear, was probably unsustainable, and changing it required admitting that singular excellence came with costs she'd been ignoring. She spent the rest of her leave wrestling with questions that had no clean answers. Could she build a life that included flying without being consumed by it? Could she develop relationships that required vulnerability when she'd spent a decade cultivating professional detachment? Could she be something other than Hog 11 without losing the identity that made sense of everything?